Hello, my name's Mike Cashman. I want to talk to you about the proposed cuts in UK foreign aid from 0.7% of GDP to 0.5% of GDP. It is still possible to change minds about this. I want to cover 3 myths concerning these cuts. Myth number 1, that it's about money. Myth number 2, that it's about value for money. Myth number 3, that the impact will be temporary. Just before I start, let me explain that I'm not wearing branded clothing from WorldVision or Voluntary Service Overseas or Disasters Emergency Committee, any of the organisations that I've worked with out in the field, for example in Kenya, Ethiopia, Sudan, Ghana, Sierra Leone for Ebola eradication, Jordan for Syria education, Nepal for earthquake rebuilding. I'm not standing here branded as VSO or WorldVision because those organisations may not necessarily share all the opinions that I'm going to put on the video. They may share some of them, that's fine, but the opinions are just mine. Okay, let's get to myth number 1. Myth number 1 was that it's about money. Now, that cut is not an enormous amount in terms of absolute money. It is an enormous amount in terms of impact, as we'll see. But in terms of money, that cut from 0.7% to 0.5% represents between 4 and 5 billion pounds. And that is not a lot of money compared to some of the things that the UK has been spending. The cut was announced in November 2020. Now, I am going to use for comparison the Dido Harding, Serco, Deloitte test and trace operation. Because in November, Dido Harding was in Parliament defending paying loads of consultants £1,000 a day as a fee rate on the basis that their services were temporary and once the system was built they wouldn't be needed anymore. So these were probably basically IT developers and she was paying way over the top for that. But the point is that at that time, there was no mention of a further £15 billion. So irrespective of what this says about Dido Harding's forecasting skills, there was not a declared need for that further large amount of money. And yet in November, the UK government could decide based on affordability that it couldn't afford another 4 to 5 billion pounds to maintain an existing legally binding commitment for UK foreign aid because it didn't have enough money. But in March 2021, and don't tell me that the economy had improved at all in that time because it hadn't, in March 2021, Rishi Sunak could wave through an extra £15 billion for Serco test and trace with barely an eyebrow raised. If we could afford 15 billion locally, we could have afforded 4 billion across the world. Never mind an NHS pay rise, that's another matter. And let's just look at the impact of £1 million, for example. Now those £1,000 a day consultants at a fee rate, if they work 200 days in a fee paying in a year, that would buy, let's say, 5, so maybe 4 to 5 of those consultants over the course of a year. Or instead of 5 for a year, 10 of them for 6 months or 20 of them for 3 months. That's what £1 million could do spent with Dido Harding. £1 million spent in northern Kenya in the Turkana region, a project using UK aid money, which I helped to plan and saw happening, could enable 700 families, some of them to clear bush, irrigate channels, so dig channels from the river to the area, clear the bush, work the land. And these are people who had previously been nomadic pastoralists, and that way of life was impossible now because of climate change, because of a climate change they did nothing to cause. But that £1 million could enable them to grow their own food, this is for 700 families, forever. at a conservative estimate of 5 people per family, 3,500 people, then that was being achieved at a cost of £300 per person, feeding them forever, certainly with a vast majority of the food that they needed. Now, let's compare that with value for money on the Deloitte Serco Harding test and trace. They haven't spent £37 billion yet. I heard reference to £9 billion having been spent a few months ago. I also heard quite recently a reference to 9 million contacts having been made. So that's a cost per contact of more than £1,000. So suppose somebody comes to you and says, I can set up this tracing application. We're going to be able to contact the people that we're going to contact. And I'll tell you what, I'll tell you how much it'll cost per contact that we make. And you say, okay, how much? They say £1,000. We'll have loads of people doing it. They'll make loads of calls. And for every contact they make, we'll charge you £1,000. It is a ludicrous amount of money. But that's, in a way, a separate point. My point is that in terms of value for money, that for £300 a person, feeding them forever is so much better value. So those cuts were not because we didn't have enough money, point one. They were not because we wanted to achieve better value for money, point two. And they are not cuts of which the impact will be temporary, and that's point three. Now the myth is, oh yeah, we've turned the dial down from 0.7% to 0.5%. We'll turn it back up to 0.7%. Things will be back as they were. This is not like filling a bath from a bath tap. There are consequences of making swinging cuts. There are core costs. There will be money reserved for humanitarian emergencies. My rough estimate, when I first heard of that cut from 0.7 to 0.5%, was that the money for new development projects of the sort that I've described would probably be cut by 50%, would be halved. As it happens, the UK aid budget for Yemen has been halved. So we prefer to play Serco and Deloitte than to help people in Yemen. And the problem with those cuts is clearly less money will be spent. Amongst other things, jobs will be lost. Skilled people, whether working in the UK at DFID headquarters or working out in the field, as I've seen, on local salaries, those people won't be working on those projects anymore. That also goes for people working within the aid agencies. Jobs will be lost. That will be the effect. That, I have to assume, was known by Cabinet. That, I have to assume, was the intention. This is not a turn the dial down, turn it back up again. This is a cut some things which will never come back. And if the money is provided later on, I have a dreadful fear that instead of being spent achieving the value for money in the sort of ways that I've described, I do have the fear that we'll start to see a lot of that money spent on outsourced management consultants. That trend is already starting, so that we might be seeing UK Serco aid. And there's a little trick that the civil service can work, which is that money spent on management consultants then can end up being counted as part of the programme budget. In other words, not as administrative expenditure. So it makes them look better. So that is what I fear. Now, I want to take a particular example of what's likely to be hit by those cuts, and that is VSO, Voluntary Service Overseas. I spent the inside of a year out in Ghana with my wife on volunteering some 10 years ago. I have no financial interest in this, I want to stress. So recently, I've been running training for groups of young people going out overseas on the youth service, the ICS service. I have been doing that, sharing some of my expertise and experience from having worked in foreign aid in foreign projects in a number of countries. I've been doing that I'm not paid at all for that. So the VSO, the little core budget that the UK government provides, leverages all of my time for free, or it has done until it got stopped. It leverages the goodwill and skill and time of cohorts and cohorts, loads and loads of young people going out to help in foreign countries with the skills that we've equipped them with, working with local people in partnership. It's one of the most effective ways to assist foreign countries. It builds the UK reputation, it builds relationships. It means young people come back to this country with an awareness of issues in the world. It builds friendships, relationships and peace. And the vast majority of the people who are involved in that are paid nothing at all for that, or out in the field a small allowance to just enable them to feed themselves, but they're not earning any money from it in effect. And all of that is at risk from these cuts. Let's just think about what we're talking about with these cuts, where the current legally established commitment is for 0.7% of everything we earn. 0.7% of 1% of everything we earn in this country. That's all we're seeking to maintain. And it can do so much good. And it can do so much more good than if we waste this money in the UK in the way that we see can easily happen. So if you'd agree with this, please write to your MP. Now, I've got a version of this talk that I wrote a week or two ago. I focus particularly on it's not about money and the impact will not be temporary, but I mentioned value for money as well. You can find that on my blog, viewdelta.blogspot.com. So I'll stick the address on the screen there. Please write to your MP. You don't have to write a long letter like I've done. You can simply write to say, look, surely 0.7%, surely 0.7 of 100th of what we earn in the UK is sensible to provide in foreign aid. And by the way, coronavirus is a problem that we solve globally or not at all. So there is some self-interest in that as well. But VSO is a wonderful organisation. It's the #1 organisation in international volunteering. Been going for 60 years. This is not something that we should be squashing, that we should be bringing to an end this overseas volunteering work. This is something that we should be preserving. Please write to your MP, and having done that, please share your letter on social media. You can, in your letter to your MP, you can say, this is an open letter, I'm planning to share it. Let's see what response you get. If you don't get a response, or even anyway, write to your local paper as well. But if you've written to your MP and not got a response, make that point to the local paper. Between us, this appalling, selfish cut from 0.7% to 0.5%, that can be turned around. And voluntary service overseas, so international volunteering, can be saved if enough of us write to our MPs. Thank you.